So to start, we'll just have everyone give an intro really quick. I'll introduce myself. My name is Nate. I'm the founder of Token Dynamics. We're a protocol design and economic audit firm focused on censorship resistance and aligning economic incentives. And I'll pass it to the rest of my panelists to introduce themselves.
Hey, I just joined Nethermind as head of institutions. Prior to that, I founded blockchain labs at IBM for a lot of time, long time. Led a bunch of Wall Street firms. I still advise the industry and some aspects of US government. So happy to be here.
Hello, I'm Armin. With Certora. We're a Web3 and digital asset security company. We do everything from helping teams build and buy in digital assets, from design to audits to monitoring and incident response.
I'm Gene from MasterCard. We do a lot of things. But yeah, my team is the Agentic and digital growth products team at MasterCard. Essentially what that means is we are the product team behind Agent Pay and all the Agentic product stuff that is starting to surround that. So things like the verifiable intent specification came out of my team in partnership with Google. So yeah, that's me.
Hi everyone, my name is Eric Chang. I run a fund called Prototype. We are essentially a multi-strategy fund, but the primary strategy is early stage venture, investing in frontier technologies such as AI, fintech, and crypto. But we also pursue some kind of liquid investments, yield farming strategies as well. Good to be here.
Nice, thank you guys. And to kick this off, we're talking about agents, liability in the audit trail. But I think we can go maybe more broad than that and give some context to the people that are watching this later and maybe some people in the audience. Like, what kinds of things are agents doing to frame this conversation with finance? What is agentic finance and the buckets of things that you guys see?
Maybe I can start and maybe you guys can. So to me, we are in the still stage of infancy. It's agentic commerce, which is lion's share of that commerce is tied to a single primitive. So like every industry, finance has primitives. It's borrowing, lending, collateralization, and deposits, which essentially emanates the other products that sit on finance, finance in general. And I think today, which we've been at this, I was working on 402 at Web3 standard level, which is, I'm dating myself at the moment. But I think today it's agentic commerce. It's largely tied to small value payments. It hasn't entered capital markets. It hasn't definitely not entered the various spectrum of payments that the industry sort of absorbs. So I would say that at this point in time, it's just simple low value payments because the risk models are a lot lower. And we can dive into as to how the networks like MasterCard, Visa, and how banking system views payments, which has all these different layers which have been touched upon this, but I think it's a fairly complicated topic.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it's very much in its infancy and people are trying a lot of things. Some people are using agents to buy and invest in, crypto or stocks. Some people are using it for payments, but I think there's definitely a lot of work to be done to get like a concrete solution or like a financial system for agents.
Yeah, I mean we're building all this infrastructure, right, to support whatever size of agentic transaction anybody wants to do. Clearly, what we're seeing in real life is most agentic commerce is sub $1 right now, right? The vast majority. There's a bit that's happening, but I think what we see, anybody who's done agentic coding, anybody who's done anything with AI agents knows you've got this wall where things, interfaces, tools designed for humans to use are typically not going to be easy for an agent to use right off the bat. And guess what? That's every merchant website that exists. Really, really hard for an agent to use in most cases, even as browser harnesses get better. So, I think we are seeing a huge amount of friction build. And what's going to be very interesting is to see how does the merchant community respond, which merchants are going to jump in first, does that open up the floodgates to a lot of volume and then it becomes a competitive thing. So yeah, that's what we're seeing at least.
Yeah, I think essentially the applications of agentic payments can fall into essentially three buckets. There's maybe two big ones and then one kind of side one. But as Gene kind of mentioned, right, I think primarily the first thing that we'll be thinking about when it comes to these agentic payments is going to be for everyday type transactions, right? Maybe in the future when merchant interfaces or harnesses get more complex, I as any kind of average Joe user can just say, hey, buy me a flight from JFK to LAX for $400, within this date or something. and then maybe then the agent will help me execute that. And that would be through, primarily some of the standards maybe popularized by MasterCard or Visa, stuff that's actually more, I guess, usable for the average retail. I think the other large bucket would primarily be for AI, right? AI applications. So this would be kind of API per calls or inference per calls, right? These would be thousands of transactions per second that's done between different agents from machine to machine, right? This is where humans are really out of the loop, and a lot of the kind of liability starts kind of coming into this structure as well. And then the last kind of shadow box here, right, is just mainly just applications of crypto, right? So what actual product market fit does crypto ultimately have, right? We have stable coins, we had casinos, gambling, meme coins. Now finally, we can use crypto to make micropayments for kind of these AI kind of payments as well. So you kind of see different kind of standards as well that popularize maybe the use of crypto, for different kind of use cases.
That's a great place to pick up on my next question. I think Gene mentioned that one of the barriers to entry for people is the interfaces, or the barrier to entry for agents themselves is lack of an interface. I mean, they don't have 5 senses the way we do, so they're processing information very differently. But the other one that I think I see is the one we're all sort of familiar with from a recent exploit of BankerBot, which is these things are not very secure. They're very subject to prompt injection, and we know SQL injection was the top exploit for 20 years from the point that they started to use SQL databases on web backends. Injection is still at number 5, and I think we'll see it ramp up. So, my question is, what are maybe the ways that we can get around that for agentic finance to flourish, and then maybe move from there? How do you guys see that evolving?
I think this is, ironically, the one thing I'm no longer worried about. I think we are in a lot of venues seeing really, really good work happening in the industry. It's a problem that a lot of people, right off the bat, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, started thinking hard about, and not limited to commerce, right? I'll plug the spec that we put out there, verifiable intent, right? Now it's open source, it's going through FIDO with AP2. The whole focus of a thing like that is any agentic action, not just commerce, but how do you have something that's auditable, that's immutable, that says, even for an agent itself, this is the thing everybody misses. We say how does a neutral third party validate that the agent is doing the right thing? But I think what we're starting to see is a lot of people coming around to, look, the agent can be a neutral first party. The agent wants to do good. You just got to give the agent a tool that it can use to say, what was my beginning state, right? What was my user's intent? What was the system intent? And did I end up in that place, or did I get something picked up along the way that made me drift away? So I don't know if you guys agree or disagree, but I'm seeing a lot of really solid work in that department, not limited to that spec that I mentioned, all over the place. A lot of people, I think, solving this problem really effectively.
Yeah, I think I agree that it's a solvable problem, and I probably don't know the details as much as you, Gene. But to me, I think when you design a system, you have to assume the agent is corruptible and that it's already corrupted. And then you design the system around that, and if your system can hold with the corrupted agent, then you have a system that works. So if your agent is able to verify that the thing it's trying to do is the thing that it's supposed to do, and it does that every time, and it can't be tricked with some words to do something else, then you have a system that works. But if your agent can be hacked or be convinced of something else, and then that breaks the system, then you have a system that doesn't work. And with BankerBot, the prompt injection was one of the problems, but they also had this, they tried to solve it, right? The agent couldn't transfer any of the funds out, but then somebody gave it this NFT that enabled it to transfer funds out, and then you get the prompt injection. So they didn't assume, or maybe they did, but they didn't think of this angle, but they didn't assume that the agent could be corrupted, and or they did, but they didn't think that, the NFT could be passed to it, and then now it can transfer money. So then, it was exploited. So it's more of a logic issue than just the prompt injection, because they thought of the prompt injection, but they missed the logic where they had to say, hey, if somebody transfers an NFT to this agent and allows them to transfer tokens, that's a problem.
I am curious, from MasterCard's standpoint, like what types of solutions are really out there, right? Now, don't get me wrong, I feel like MasterCard's solution is very robust, right? You need to do KYC to actually attribute your identity to a certain agent, right? These transactions are tokenized. There's certain intents that's also cryptographically kind of baked into each of these transactions. But, it's also based on my understanding that a lot of these prompt injection attacks, right, where you're kind of hiding, some kind of hidden instruction, on a document or like a memo that people can't read with their human eyes, this stuff actually comes before the actual signature, right? At some point, you make the intent and just say sign, this is what I want my agent to be doing. But that doesn't actually stop the agent from being able to read a prompt injected kind of instruction later on before they actually execute the transaction, right? That's what basically happened with BankerBot. And the BankerBot company actually made the argument saying, hey, it's not up to me. The user controls the agent. They're the ones that kind of sign on to this risk before they started using our infrastructure. We take no liability, right? And even right now in a court of law, that's still not settled as to who actually takes on that liability. Or so in this instance, right, if something similar happens with a much larger player such as Visa, MasterCard, what kind of stance would MasterCard be taking, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. There will be no single, I'll say there will be no two-node solution to this kind of thing. For a lot of the reasons, it's a great example to keep going back to this exploit, because in the BankerBot example, yeah, if you go back to the user was at fault in so many ways, right? But on the other hand, we know, right, especially if we talk about consumer commerce, putting the consumer at fault and saying, you're going to be ultimately responsible if your agent screws up, it's not a viable proposition, right? Consumers are so now used to, all of us in the room are so used to being able to pay for a thing and know that because I used this, because I did whatever was asked of me, maybe I used, biometric, maybe whatever. If I do those things, I'm safe, right? I'm all good. So we can't violate that. And so in order to reach that promise, you need to have a few different things that happen here. If you're going to let a cardholder or a payer delegate their authority to spend to their agent, you're going to need things like, not only can that agent self-check, like that's the first piece, but the merchant who's accepting a transaction, right, the payee, whether a merchant or anybody else, needs to have agency in the flow to say, what do I need to see before I'm going to take a risk and accept the transaction, right? And so providing visibility to what the stated intent was to the payee, also important. But equally important is providing a loop back to who is operating that agent. If it's a consumer, if it's a business, you need an independent, separate place where the true content of that finalized, signed intent sort of thing, whatever form that takes, can actually be inspected by that party. Because that's where, if something got injected at that point, that moment of truth, right, where it's being signed, and somehow somebody found an exploit where something gets presented to me, and then the intent gets signed, and something got injected right in that little liminal moment, if you allow me, or you force me even in the riskiest scenarios, to re-inspect it post-signature, I'm going to look at it and see what got injected, clear as day, right? So all these things sound operationally hard because they are. It's a thing consumers aren't used to doing. But if I'm spending $5 on a cup of coffee through my agent, that's one thing. But if I'm spending $5,000 through my agent, right, on a whole new Sonos setup or whatever else, I might want to take a look at that before that goes through. So.
We've been looking at this from a point of view, thank you. We're looking at this from point of view of transactionality. So blockchains, by the way, the industry done piss poor job of UI, UX for the 15 plus years we've been at this. So finally we found an avenue to exercise all the innovation that's come into blockchain world. But I do want to discern between agentic payments and agentic finance. So many of the startups who came here who made the claim that, hey, we don't have custody of the asset, we don't touch the asset. But as he will tell you, that MasterCard is a regulated financial payment market infrastructure. So every sort of infrastructure that facilitates movement of assets is still regulated. And so payment is one thing where you're looking at paying for some things, which means you have some level of verification validation, the shipping of physical goods or in some case digital goods. Whereas if you were to look at the capital markets, which is extension of movement of money in return of other asset classes, your regulatory threshold goes up. So Cloudflare guy had like 4 or 5 layers, which is great for payments. That significantly becomes complicated. So agency to me becomes a really critical component of it.
It's not optional, right?
It's not optional. And I would say there are 3 things that we, at least in financial markets, look at is causation, root cause analysis, what went wrong. And you have to envision every use case. So bank bot is not exactly, it's a snafu, but you cannot just say, hey, we did our best part, it's user. In your case too, in MasterCard, you have some accountability even if user makes a mistake. So you have to factor those things into the market infrastructure to provide the resiliency and security that the financial market is supposed to extend to its end users. And I would say that, I'll pause there, but that is an essential part, which none of the stacks that we talk about focus on transactionality verification and trust, but no one talks about the agency element of agentic commerce and agentic finance.
And so, yeah, I mean, to state it differently, and then I want to see, as we pivot maybe to the agentic finance piece of it, because I could talk about agentic payments all day and commerce all day and shopping all day and even micropayments. But really, access to a protected or regulated resource, the agency of the provider of that resource is often a regulated thing. They have responsibilities that they have to meet, right? And so how do you allow somebody like Vanguard, right, to fulfill their obligations to KYC their customer if their customer is reaching them through an agent? Right? How do you reach across that agentic layer? So I'm curious what you guys are seeing there.
Yeah, and I think that points to the broader bifurcation of agency that we've seen in crypto over the years, which is a pivot more toward the consumer in some ways, and then in other networks and other ecosystems, it's a focus on self-sovereignty and these crops values that the Ethereum Foundation has put out and whatnot. So I'm curious how you guys think about like what the correct approach is, and maybe are there hybrid approaches that you've seen, or what are each of your favorite approaches to enabling users to have agency while maintaining some sort of maybe either a sense of safety or like compliance, if that's the angle that you'd like to go for?
I think the core thing there is what I mentioned earlier is, build a system assuming the agent's corrupted. Assume it's not secure, and then solve for that, and then that high level. That's what works.
What does that look like, and like what maybe an example of a system that does
I'm
that
not
well
familiar with
versus
something
not?
that works at scale today, and probably Gene knows better than me.
I think we're
but
building something that works at scale. We'll hope.
Amazing.
We see. Right, but yeah, same thing. We say there's no such thing as a trusted agent. Right, it's a non-thing. That's a major principle that we're building on right now.
And the interesting thing with that is the banker situation. Actually, Grok had the account that got the money stolen. I imagine MasterCard's not giving an account to Grok, right? So something like that's not going to happen. And then it's very clear who's at fault. The user, if the user has his money and the user's money is stolen, probably MasterCard is going to take some blame, right? Here, BankerBot had an account for Grok. Grok got this money by just creating a token. I think it's a very interesting case, but I don't know if it applies to the real world once we get, the infrastructure we need.
Well, maybe not to a system that's built on KYC and legal recourse and things, but and I think MasterCard's probably doing the best work in that space. But how do we enable those users that still want self-sovereignty and want a more free version of the web where they can use their own agent? Anyone can spin up an agent, like they can spin up a website and accept or send payments from that place.
Yeah, I think in this case, other kind of standards might be, more fit for the purpose that you're talking about, right? So like X402, for example, which is popularized by Coinbase, is actually quite an interesting solution where, it does come with its risks, right? So there's no KYC that comes with the wallet. The on-chain signature that you do for the transaction with your wallet counts as your kind of intent for that certain transaction, right? And then that is, allows you to kind of do a lot of machine-to-machine kind of interactions in a lot more permissionless manner. You're able to just kind of transact crypto, and that's actually a lot more fit for also just more micropayments through, on the AI kind of application side. But yeah, that comes with a whole slew of different types of risks, right? When you don't really have a human in the loop, and you don't really have biometrically kind of verified intent. Like typically, I think there is a feature on MasterCard where you actually have to, use a pass key, scan your fingerprint, do your kind of facial recognition to say, hey, I'm the one that's telling, my agent to go do a certain transaction, right? But you can get into the nitty gritty, like it starts being, if you're trying to do AI-based transactions for API calls or inference, and you're trying to do it completely decentralized on X402, you could potentially set up, state channels, right? Both parties are setting up some kind of escrow saying, okay, we're both putting in X amount of dollars per this period of time. This is when we can just kind of free flow send transactions to each other, at any point in time, and up until that state channel kind of breaks, right? Or you can also do kind of like prepaid credit or kind of metered kind of streaming kind of payments, and then these all come with their own kind of checks and balances and different liabilities.
I think it's critical, right, that, and this is a piece that we're working really hard on, is something like X402, it works really, really well, right? But we want to enable the parties who are exchanging funds over X402 to be able to scale up or down the degree of risk commensurate with the degree of effort, right? So if you want to have more connectivity, if you want to have a higher burden of authentication, these things, we can't think about it from a pure consumer standpoint. Easy, actually, is the consumer side, where I have a fingerprint or a Face ID on my phone. But B2B, how do you use things like pre-existing terms and scopes and states that can actually be mutually agreed between the counterparties? So I think that's where the hard work is, because the way that the industry wants to go is into a more open, interoperable, standardized, where, sure, I can take a risk, right? If I kind of know who my counterparty is, maybe I don't need the full length of burden on a technical standpoint.
So two things, I want to discern between two things, because we are so heavily focused on X402, which to me is just an API sort of standard. I used to work on 402, which was, again, I'm dating myself on what used to be, but we didn't have the digital assets to complete 402. So we went down the credit card route and layered those on different standards. Is automation what we want from agents? Or is it the agency and ability for them to act on their own? So if you're giving commands to the agents, is it really agentic? For example, we've had algo trading. So I come from capital markets background, right? So there's a lot of resistance on algo trading, and this is analytics, automation functions. So if the narrative is just around, let's automate this, and we have blockchain to suddenly now process transactions, which again which doesn't have the burden of existing financial system to move assets, then we've solved the infrastructure problem. But what are we trying to achieve from agents? And I always ask that question to say, is this just automation play? Or is it supposed to actually revolutionize the way we are able to engage in saying, like the last chat before Google chat was about the fact that if I have my data and I want my agent to go and monetize the data, which, suddenly now agents are data hungry, can they interact and use my guardrails to negotiate my behalf while I'm sleeping? It's more than automation at that point.
I think it's both, right? I think effectively, somebody asked me the other day, well, how do we differentiate between human in the loop and non-human in the loop transactions? And I think there too, you're never not going to have a human in the loop. It's just a question of how enormous is the loop, right? The loop can be gigantic, but somewhere you've got a human or a business that benefits a human that has determined a goal for an agent and maybe some constraints. And that could be a set of constraints and a goal that runs for years autonomously once it's been set. If it works well and the output is good, why should you change those constraints or have to go back and get back in the loop, right? So I think the loop just stretches as the systems get better at what they're doing.
And accountability and culpability. This is something which I wrote a paper on topic, had a session, it's like who's really accountable when things go wrong. And until you have a throat to choke, essentially, it becomes really hard to make this acceptable because we still have to hold people accountable, not code in general. But sorry.
Yeah, to answer your first question, I think it's kind of, to me, it's not clear that there is like a lot of demand for agency. I think there is at its current abilities. I think there is demand for this idealistic version of agency where you have this robot and he does stuff for you and you don't have to like worry. But like at the current state, I think there's a few people that are super deep in the weeds that want this. And then most normal people, and even especially businesses, a business is not going to say, yeah, this agent is responsible.
Normal people.
Yeah, like, not people in this room, people, even maybe outside the city, like, we're further on the, tech frontier than most people. And most people aren't like, oh, I need an agent to buy, detergent for me every time it runs out. I think, that's not their day-to-day problem. So automation is more useful for businesses. So I imagine that's kind of, what we'll solve first. And then for automation, more agency is better because then you can automate more. And as Gene's saying, you make the circle bigger, and then eventually you get these, agents that are good, and then you go to someone and say, hey, you can trust this thing. It's going to buy all the stuff you need. You don't need to like go on Amazon every day and order it or whatever. Like it could. I think that's kind of where I'll go. So to me, short answer, I think the agency demand for most people isn't there yet.
Could I ask a question to the panel? Can I hijack a little bit? It just invites the question, I think, what do you guys think will be that point where it goes over the wall and normal people start to get the bug, right? Like, how do people get agent pilled outside of New York and SF?
I think a far out point is humanoid robots that can do stuff, but maybe it'll be earlier. But to me, it's like, hey, this humanoid robot just cleaned my house and he ran out of detergent for the laundry. He can go and, buy laundry, and you can like read its knowledge thinking trace to verify that it's like doing the right thing and it's not, gonna steal the money or whatever, and give it credit for $20 to buy the detergent.
So I'll say this, right, for payments and shopping, the flows are really, really simple. You're taking this to agentic finance, things like repo markets, collateral management, ability to move. These are really, really complicated flows, sometimes have 18 legs. And so I would say the ubiquity, I use the word the ubiquity of agents become the back office non-fiduciary, non-prudential work to say, I'm going to go and do all this sort of security checks and checks that I have to do, which doesn't involve holding. Even that's, I think, a viable use case because that still takes away a lot of inefficiencies in the blockchain-based transaction financial system that we aspire to create. I'll pass it on to you.
I just want to say, I feel like we're just not AGI pilled enough, honestly, right? It could happen within the next couple of years, right? Agents can become a lot more complex. The weird thing about AI is that it's really hard to actually pinpoint when something is going to happen, but we're just entering this kind of weird technological adoption kind of cycle where if you could imagine that there's a certain possibility that this thing will happen, it inevitably will eventually happen, right? And regardless of like how that actually affects society and whether we'll still be able to maintain our individual consciousness, down the line, once we achieve this supercomputer AGI kind of status, that's for other people to figure out, right? But as investors and capitalists, right, if you're a company and you're not addressing for this larger addressable market, then you're going to lose out, right? If I'm MasterCard and I have a ton of latency when I'm checking on every single API call or inference payment with these agents, then I'm not going to be able to kind of pinpoint or corner that kind of AI kind of compute market, right? Which is why I thought X402 is actually so interesting because it really does take that latency out of the equation, right? But then that in itself births a whole bunch of different types of risks and liabilities, right? How do you actually put in safeguards, or when agents start creating other agents and they start setting up other wallets for themselves, right? How do you really control that, right? And I don't think anyone in this room actually has a good answer to that.
So do you plug in, the question for you, do you club agentic frameworks with AGI? Are you clubbing them in the same club or in the same group?
Yeah, I would say so, yeah.
But there could be some pre-AGI stuff that's useful. But you should plan for AGI, I guess what you're saying.
No, I'm just saying that there are two different sort of fields, but I also think that we expect agency from humans, and we are not there yet. We're not expecting agency from agents at the moment. But to me, AGI is a whole different sort of conversation than agentic framework, which is worker bees doing stuff, not exactly the super agents or super intelligent entities, so to speak.
I think that's the once you stretch the loop all the way to where you can't even tell when you were in it anymore, like maybe that's what AGI feels like, where you're just coexisting with an agent and it's as easy as talking to somebody that you really trust, right? That is going to come through, will anticipate what you need. We know people like that. We have people like that in our lives. when my AI agent can meet that same standard, like to me, that's what AGI should feel like.
I think the question is just going to be how many tokens do you have to spend to build that loop? So with that, I think we're out of time. Thank you guys. I'd love to continue the AGI conversation off stage, and thank you for coming. Thank you all.